Thank you all for being here, spending your afternoon with us here at TasNetworks. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. My name is Liz Marriott and I'm a member of the Strategic Engagement team here at TasNetworks. I'm joined by a number of my colleagues here today and I'll introduce them all as we head through today's presentation. Just as a courtesy to let you all know that we are recording today's webinar, and that's so that we can do some really thorough reporting afterwards, but also share it with those who are not able to make it today. And we will, of course, distribute slides after today's webinar, so don't feel like you have to take furious notes because we will share that around to everyone who has registered and attended today. Thanks, Nels. If you'd like to move on. Next slide, please. I would like to start with an acknowledgement of the country on which we're all meeting today, which for many of us is Nipaluna or Hobart. I am acknowledging the Palawa, Tasmanian Aboriginal people, as the traditional and continuing custodians of Lutruwita, the land on which many of us are gathering from today. I pay respect to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to anyone of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background in the session with us today. Welcome. All right, thank you, Nils. On to today's agenda. As mentioned, we've got you for 2 hours this afternoon and we will be getting out the door at 4 p.m. sharp, if not slightly before. We're starting with opening remarks from Acting CEO Michael Westenberg, and then we'll be going into the annual planning report, the 2024 report, with Niels Blickfeldt. Then we'll be moving on to an environmental scan with our Head of Strategy, Jessica Ray. And following on from that, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the system strength, RIT-T, with Chris Noy, Matthew Clark and Nick Jatan. And then we'll do a wrap up and close and cover off on any actions or additional questions that you might have before we set you on your way for today. I will let you know that obviously this is a public setting, and so we'll provide key contacts at the end of the webinar if you have any specific questions that you don't feel like asking in that public forum. I'm also joined today by my colleague Jordan Abel. He is monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, you can either put your hand up or you can pop it in the chat and we'll make sure that we come around and answer your question. Anything we can't cover off in today's session, we commit to coming back to all attendees just so that there's clarity and equity of information shared. All right, just in terms of that, there are quite a few people online today, so I do ask if it's just one person at a time, hand raising for questions. And as we head through the presentation, I'll leave it up to each presenter. They can indicate if they will take questions during their section or if they'd prefer for them to be held to the end of their section, which is sometimes the case when we're working through some more technical information, as we will be today. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Michael Westenberg, our acting CEO for this week and for his opening remarks. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction, and thank you for the acknowledgement of country. Just wanted to say welcome to everyone here today. I can see a lot of the energy supply chain represented here, and thank you for spending the afternoon with us. Over the next 2 hours, our team will step through key highlights from our 2024 annual planning report covering our distribution and transmission networks, some highlights about the broader operating environment we find ourselves operating in, and a dedicated session on our system strength regulatory investment test. For our annual planning report, I guess as Tasmania jurisdictional planning body for Australia's national energy market, TasNetworks must continually review the adequacy of our state's transmission and distribution electricity networks to ensure they are fit for our current and future needs. We do so via the annual planning report. The annual planning report is a requirement of the National Electricity Rules, and more importantly, it is also a key part of our planning process and a snapshot in time, casting both a backwards glance to assess our distribution and transmission network performance over the past year, as well as casting a longer look ahead, providing an overview of our development plans for the coming decade. And from my perspective, it's no more important time than doing that now. Our 2024 annual planning report details several key developments and activities, including variable renewable energy generation growth, the progression of renewable hydrogen industry development, the increased interconnection capacity with the mainland, and contributions of Tasmania's power system to national objectives, including AEMO's ISP. The annual planning report ties in with our broader regulatory and strategic planning activities, and giving its frequency enables us to iteratively revise our plans when there are changes in the external environment and shifts in our customers' expectations and needs. This latter point, read customer expectations and needs, has become increasingly critical for our business, with understanding and responding to our customers and our communities, one of our strategic pillars in our company strategy launched in 2023. This means the work is being prioritised at all levels in our business, with dozens of individual projects and initiatives either in progress or planned for delivery to help us build a business that genuinely places customers' needs at the centre of our decision-making process. This year's annual planning report also ties in with the first year of our new regulatory control period, which runs in 5 yearly cycles, this one through until 30th June 2029. Niels Bleckfeld, our Principal Network Planning Engineer, will unpack the APR in more detail shortly. In relation to the operating environment we see ourselves operating in, looking beyond TasNetworks, we see that Tasmania is experiencing similar trends to other states regarding decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitalisation of the energy sector, albeit at a different pace and approach to the rest of the country. We're using our smarter system with growing advanced meters to better understand and forecast this at a more granular level, preparing ourselves for these as solar, electric vehicles, battery and electrification of load play out in different ways and at different points across our network. Jess Ray, our Head of Strategy, will step through the key trends and insights and her team have been working on soon. The System Strength RIT team. Earlier this month, TasNetworks published a report outlining how we intend to meet system strength requirements forecast by the Australian Energy Market Regulator until 2029. This report concludes that existing assets within Tasmania can meet Tasmania's forecast system strength needs. And rounding out our time today, Chris Noy and Matthew Clark from our regulatory team and Nick DeChan from our network operations will explain system strength, the methodology used to assess our options to forecast until 2029, and how we arrived at our preferred option. On behalf of TasNetworks, our thanks again for your interest in how our networks are performing, as well as our forward plans. Now I'll hand over to Nels to start unpacking our 2024 annual planning report. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to echo my thanks for your attendance and time this afternoon. And for those of you who are attending again this year, welcome back. Thank you, Liz and Mike, for that great intro. I think Mike's really covered off a lot of the crux of the purpose of the annual planning report. In every year, we do want to perhaps emphasise some different parts of the APR. And this year, we're going to emphasise a little bit more about the recent ISP, which was published this year, and recent work we're doing around reinforcement of the Central Highlands REZ. I'll go through at a reasonable pace today, but please, if you've got some questions or really burning issues, as Liz mentioned, I'm comfortable for you to chime in and ask some questions. We're here to engage, so please don't hesitate if you've got some questions, and we'll kick off. So, as Mike said, the APR remains an important planning document, and we use each year for both backward-looking, a snapshot of the existing network, and obviously forward projection over the next 10 years. The APR does seek to look slightly beyond that hard line of the 10-year window through mechanisms like a demand and energy forecasting, because many investments that initiate during the next 10 years intend to carry forward perhaps into 15 or even 20 years. and encapsulating a lot of the planning environment that we work within, especially the integrated system plan, has a forward view for up to 20 years as well. So just a couple of developments of note that appear in the APR, and I'll go through some of these today. First off, with Marinus Link, obviously our progression towards Marinus Link with FID is planned for 2025. We'll talk a bit about how Marinus Link is treated in the integrated system plan. We have to work within the Tasmanian Renewable Energy Target TRET targets, which is this the planting and development of new renewable generation in Tasmania in order to achieve a 200% generation or energy generation production capability by 2040. We also have continued development through the Tasmanian Renewable Hydrogen Action Plan around development of large-scale hydrogen electrolyser facilities in Tasmania, which is now centred its priorities for the Bell Bay Georgetown area. Of course, we have the integrated system plan, as I mentioned. In the last APR, they were between publications, and at the middle of this year, they finalised the 2024 publication. Now, TasNetworks work closely as a jurisdictional planner to work with AEMO, so much of the outcomes of the ISP are in no small part from consultations with TasNetworks in terms of input assumptions and critical information that AEMO take into consideration when coming up with their ISP. We have the continuance of the system strength rule changes, as our colleagues here will talk more about, which is the progression of the RIT-T for system strength management. And as Michael touched on, we now have commenced our next determination or next revenue reset period for 24 to 29. And we raise this in the context of the APR due to the discussion around contingent projects in particular, some of those geared towards augmentations of the network to facilitate changes that come about from generation, and also those that I'll talk about today, which are around the first tranche of load or hydrogen connections at Georgetown. So as we do each year, and for those who are new to the APR, a little bit of a quick rundown on the cross-section of Tasmania in terms of energy production and consumption. So the first chart I'll talk to here, this pie chart, is a bit of what it seeks to demonstrate is how, when generation or energy is produced in Tasmania, where does that energy go? So rather than talking about load driven, this is this generation that's produced on island. Now, Tasmania, amongst its big four transmission connected MIs and remaining transmission customers, consume over 50% of that generated energy that's produced in Tasmania. Approximately 40% of it is consumed in our distribution network, and usually approximately 10% of the additional surplus generation is exported through Basslink. That's typically how the numbers go each year. Obviously, the consumption by MIs is the single largest dominant factor, and that's fairly consistent year on year. If we consider the generation and load profile for Tasmania, Tasmania has maintained a state close to what we've termed energy neutrality. It's where Tasmania has the self-sufficiency with on-island generation to meet its energy demand requirements over the course of the year. What we see from the trending here for the last 5 years indicates obviously we've sat close to that energy neutrality point. In 2021, we had a slight surplus of energy, which went through to net export to the NEM. And in 2022, and similarly in 2023, most of the consumption was met by hydro and wind generation, with approximately 6% through net import through Basslink to satisfy the total energy requirements. And those sit at just above 10,000 gigawatt hours per annum. I'll talk a bit more about how the energy consumption figures look as we go into different forecasting scenarios. But for Tasmania, we've really remained at a fairly comfortable and well understood state of equilibrium in our network. As a cross-section of demand in Tasmania, how we typically use a metric to describe this is through a load duration characteristic. And what we see for Tasmania is that the demand varies between approximately 800 megawatts at minimum demand times to about 2 times that amount at about 1,700 megawatts. And so throughout the year, the demand profile is relatively flat if we scale between those 2 points. But typically, average demand or our 50th percentile or probability of exceedance sits at around 1200 megawatts. The second curve that we show here illustrates the overlay of when we consider Basslink export superimposed on top of this. So this is where Basslink at maximum export pushes the total network demand, as we term it that way, above 2000 megawatts. And that has more of a reflection on the generated dispatch of generation across Tasmania, but also the power flows through the transmission network in servicing that demand. And again, the shapes of these curves in the approximate profiles are reasonably consistent year on year. We have seen some increases or changes in reactive consumption at different times and different loading conditions, but for the most part, the real power components remain reasonably consistent. Now, these curves will obviously dramatically change if we consider the overlay of adding additional interconnection, where we have the either the additional load requirement or load burden of the interconnectors like Marinus Link drawing more power out of the state, but also an offset by what additional generation supply may be provided depending on the load profiles. Now I'll go a bit to talk about the ISP. And as we said in last year's APR, we are essentially in a holding pattern until the finalisation of the 2024 ISP. Now that has come, we've now commenced the next planning period for the upcoming ISP for 2026. So we're in a constant state of recursive planning with AEMO. However, it's important to take a pause just to capture what the current snapshot for planning is, and snapshot for Tasmania and the NEM. For those fairly unfamiliar with the ISP, I assume a lot of you today have seen it quite prominently, but I'll just briefly recap on its objectives. So AEMO, who are responsible for directing the ISP, put it together as a whole estate business plan, a system plan, I should say, and roadmap for the next 20 years. And its underpinned objectives are maintenance of reliability and security, pricing quality, which is an important one about least cost and effective and optimal investment, and the need to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And what drives a lot of these broader changes across the NEM and the necessity to have a national plan is the timed retirements of coal generation in the NEM. And Tasmania plays an important role as a stakeholder and part of the jurisdictional planner for the ISP, in that we have extremely good potential for wind resources and a network that can be optimised to be developed at a scale efficient way to harness those resources. And to that end, the ISP includes, for 2024, includes two important outcomes. The first is the confirmation of the 1500 megawatt Marinus Link in both its components, which is the 750 stages 1 and 2, as a single actionable project, and it remains classified as such, delivered at the moment in optimal timings of 2030 and 2032. Secondly, we have the inclusion of the newly actionable Wadamana Palmerston transmission upgrade. Now, in previous ISPs, this was an augmentation that was considered a future project, but because of the viability of wind resources in the Central Highlands REZ, this project is now being considered actionable, which means that a regulatory investment test has now been triggered for this project. And TasNetworks are now undertaking the RIT for that piece of work. I'll talk a bit more about that Wadamana Palmerston project briefly as I go through the Central Highlands REZ. The next point, I just sort of try to paint a picture for what the ISP considers to be new generation developments in Tasmania and what we see coming down the pipeline under these planning scenarios that the ISP has. I provide an example here, and this is a snapshot of the generation planting for what they call the step change scenario under the ISP. What it shows here, we have the nominated REZs in Tasmania, which is the Northwest REZ, the Northeast REZ, Central Highlands REZ, and the North Tasmanian Coast REZ. And all of these have excellent wind resources, and depending on the degree to which investments will be efficient in terms of unlocking generation, there are varying rankings of these REZs in terms of how they can be developed and when. What's interesting this year to note for the ISP, first off, is I'll talk about the overall quantum of generation build. So what we see here is a steady increase in the total amount of planted generation, in this case wind generation developments. We see it increasing quite sharply around 2030 from the existing levels of 500 megawatts up to above 2000 megawatts. And then a continued increase towards 2044 where it surpasses 2,500 megawatts. Those figures in terms of capacity are set, or in a sense, directed by the legislated TRED. So these are the numbers of the new wind generation that are necessary to be planted in Tasmania to meet or exceed TRED. In this case, the objective function is to meet it. We can see as another observation this year is also the makeup of where that wind is coming from. In other words, which res. And we note a more prominent contribution from the Central Highlands res early on in the early build cycle, with the Northwest and other reses building out in the later years. So to paint a bit more context about energy and supply balance, when I was showing the stacked curves earlier, there's a bit of information in this graph that I'll just describe here, but it explains some of the challenges that we see in terms of meeting supply. What we compare first, so I'll talk about the TRED targets. I think we've discussed this already about the requirements for energy production, but we have the intermediate target by 2030, which is the increase of the existing energy generation capability in Tasmania up to 15,000 gigawatt hours per year, up from the existing 10,000 gigawatt hours per year presently. And the 2040 target, which is nosing just above 20,000 gigawatt hours per year. Those are the set points that the TRED legislative targets outline for generation development. If we look at the ISP's projections for wind generation, that's the yellow curve, and that's essentially the total amount when converting the megawatts that we showed in the previous curve to megawatt hours, or in this case, gigawatt hours. So that's the total energy production from the build that the ISP's overall analysis is deemed optimal. And we can see that it meets and exceeds those targets before plateauing out towards 2040, where we've met that requirement. What does it mean, though, for the generation and supply balance in Tasmania? And so what I've included in this chart is the two charts that illustrate differences in scenarios around consumption in Tasmania changing, as well as generation changing. What we first see is the state energy demand forecast under the step change scenario. So this is a product of demand forecasting that's undertaken via AEMO. They have various different publications and releases that they provide where these planning scenarios and demand forecast are used, the ISP being, and the ESU being another one. So this step change scenario indicates it's a product of steady developments and business electrification, which are one of the most dominant and significant contributors to new energy development in Tasmania. What we do see as an additional offset to that scenario in Tasmania where hydrogen is developed earlier and at a much sharper trajectory than might be outlined in the step change scenario. And that's why I've included the red curve as well to illustrate what kind of change we see. And so two observations to be drawn from this, and no doubt there are others, but one key one is that under TRED, the Tasmanian build of generation provides sufficient energy to meet the state energy demand under the step change basic scenario without any significantly large upticks in new hydrogen. But as soon as we start to realise the tranches, if all of the combined interest of hydrogen developments eventuate, is that we'll experience an energy deficit, which I think is unsurprising, and that there'll be obviously a significant reliance on interconnection to provide that energy deficit if more generation is not built in Tasmania. So that's a challenge that will need to be considered, and notwithstanding energy firming for even the smaller amounts of new load in Tasmania, and seeing how quickly this new generation will develop and where in the network. So when we talked a bit about the reses before, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about Central Highlands res this year. Now obviously our APR continues to include information on the supporting Northwest transmission developments. This year I thought we'd emphasise a bit more about Central Highlands, as the Northwest has been in the public space for a couple of years. So again, just to talk a bit about this area generally. So geographically, the Central Highlands res extends from Palmerston southwards towards Waidamana and through Waidamana and down towards Laiputa. The transmission network and the general prospects of this area being developed as a res has always been a favourable condition, and the area is very has a lot of potential for development due to the high quality resource of wind generation that's in close proximity to the network. And that's the important point for this area, is that it allows the possibility for new wind to be connected close to the network without the need to have to extend the network geographically far away to pick up new generation. The existing network between Waitemata and Palmerston, we've got a high capacity 220 kV transmission corridor. And at the moment, the network has what they deem the hosting capacity, which is the capability for generation to connect at approximately 530 megawatts of capability. In the area, we've seen a combined interest of over 2,500 megawatts from new proponents, which is considering a mix of wind, which is more than half, solar generation, BESS and hydro. And an important part from this is under the integrated system plan projections, under both prevalent scenarios being the step and progressive changes, both of those forecast over 1,000 megawatts of generation developed in the Central Highlands in the next 10 years. And so what kind of augmentations accompany this to unlock that generation? There are two key investments or two key upgrades that allow the new generation to connect. The first is developments in the Northwest Transmission, in particular the Sheffield to Palmerston and Sheffield through to Heybridge backbone upgrades. That in and of itself does increase a little bit of the hosting capacity in the Central Highlands by about approximately 100 megawatts more. But the big change that comes and the big increase we see is from an upgrade of the Waitemata to Palmerston corridor. By doing that, the first project will, we foresee at the moment with our analysis, an increase of up to 1,300 megawatts of additional generation through that corridor. And a lot of that generation coming from generation that could connect to Waitemata, to Palmerston substation, or to cut into the transmission line or corridor between Waitemata to Palmerston, or the transmission corridors going southwards from Waitemata towards Laiputa or Waitemata down to Lindisfarne. It's just important that both of those augmentations need to be in place. So whilst the Northwest or the Sheffield Palmerston corridor itself early on doesn't immediately increase the hosting capacity, it is necessary for that 1,300 though to be realised, so that you've got an upstream amount of upgraded network to facilitate and carry and transit that new generation through to Marinus Link. And that's what is assumed here along with this project with coincident timing. Actually, so before I step on, I'll just briefly to reiterate, we're commencing the RIT process for the Waitemata Palmerston project. And because it's an actionable project, that's essentially progressed the project through to the project assessment, draft report publication or preparation of those works, where we're doing both a technical and economic assessment of the project, which is considering various options for implementing this project. At a very high level, we're considering options such as the construction of a new 220 kV double circuit line, in other words, a diverse connection, or potentially options for upgrading the existing 110 network and bringing it up to spec. At this stage, we're going through that process, and as I said, by I think the middle of next year, we'll be publishing the PATA, and we'll be engaging on that project more. Just moving along a bit to another part of the network now. We've talked. Oh, yep, we've got a comment. Sorry. All right, we'll make the question later if that's okay with the written ones. So for Georgetown now, we talked a bit about R24 and including the contingent project suite of projects. This one is towards the developments of the emergence of hydrogen tranches connecting into Georgetown. We'd spoken briefly about this in last year's APR, and since the publication of our R24 contingent project report outlines the sequence in which we see load connecting. We're undertaking preliminary studies and have put forward contingent projects for different tranches of hydrogen. So rather than expecting a single connection of 1,000 megawatts at once, because we've seen interest from proponents that vary roughly between 300 to 700 to 1,000 megawatts, we're first considering the initial connection of 300 megawatts as a baseline and considering the augmentations needed to support that new load. The diagram I've shown here is really an outline of when many of those tranches connect. And so varying solutions for new load connections involve, but are not limited to, upgrade to existing network, including a new double circuit between Sheffield to Georgetown, the establishment of a co-located substation, which is driven really around network security and contingency size risks, and the establishment and installation of dynamic reactive support, which is critical for voltage stability, which becomes more of a problem as we add more load. To speak a bit more on that, I thought this year I'd speak a bit about some of the studies that we've been doing to understand the nature of the problem. And so what I've shown here is some preliminary results we've undertaken from some voltage stability studies. This is by no means an exhaustive outcome, and it's certainly there's quite a lot of variation between the operating states of the network. But what I'll explain here is the studies undertook looked at a baseline assumption for a 300 megawatt additional load at Georgetown, and then considered how the voltage at Georgetown varied during disturbance events. And we applied a series of contingency events to the network and then looked at the network response to those conditions. In particular, the relationship between voltage at the bus bar at Georgetown and the degree to which reactive power is either injected or absorbed. One of the screening tests that we use to undertake an early indication of the stability of the voltage is through reactive margin analysis, or a QV curve. So the chart on the right illustrates the results of having undertaken a few of these contingencies. An important observation to see from some of these curves initially is that all of the curves are in the positive region on the y-axis. What that means is that with the additional load connected to Georgetown, it experiences what we call a reactive margin deficiency. In other words, there's insufficient reactive margin with reactive power to satisfy S5.1.8 of the electricity rules for minimum reactive margin. And in other words, means that there has to be reactive support continuously in service in order to support the load. And in order to support the load both under system steady state conditions, but also for these more severe contingencies. The worst we can see here is the highest curve, which is the Sheffield to Georgetown outage, where we can see a deficiency of over 200 megabars, meaning that we'd have to install some dynamic reactive support, a significantly large dynamic reactive support. It's also important that reactive compensation, okay, so to maintain reactive margin under end state and N-1 state is important, but we have to also factor in steady state voltages in both the pre and post contingent operating case. And what we found from these studies was that in addition to just the amount to get the QV curves to be compliant under the rules, we also had to consider additional reactive support in order to maintain our pre-fault voltages of around 1.025 per unit. That's a requirement in order for the network to function, which is the center of the Georgetown nominal operating band of about 1 to 1.05 per unit. And under all credible contingencies, Georgetown voltage must also land satisfactorily, which means that it's nominally classed in a range of approximately 0.9 to 1.1 per unit. That's post-contingent. All this to say that means we need additional reactive support to allow that to happen. So for such conditions, we have the reactive plant that we'd have to put in place must be designed such that Georgetown's post-contingent voltage is actually sustained above 0.95 per unit. So that's what we ended up finding from the results. So not just down the bottom end of the 0.9, that was too low. If it goes below 0.95, we start to approach the limit of where Baslink's under voltage run-back control commences, and that's typically voltages around about 0.91 and below. So there are additional conditions that need to be put in place. Now, the outcome from all of this analysis was that we started to see not a linear relationship between the requirements or load conditions needed at Georgetown, but actually it starts to get exponential the further up we go. And if we look at this chart for load increments, we see at approximately 300 megawatts at Georgetown that we need approximately 500 megabars of dynamic reactive support, which is from the studies indicates a mix of both static and dynamic reactive. So that's including capacitor banks and lightly StatComs required to maintain healthy voltages. Now, the premise of how we justify this from an economic perspective is we run the analysis for installation of dynamic reactive support compared against what we currently do today, which is constraining Basslink. And so the RIT-T that we'll be undertaking for the investment we need to make around load connections at Georgetown and managing dynamic reactive support or voltage stability is traded off against constraining Basslink and constraining under export conditions when these voltage conditions are at their worst. So just to briefly speak about the RIP-T timeframe, we're obviously undertaking that process at the moment, and we'll be publishing the PSCR for that report at the end of this month. The PSCR will outline 2 identified needs in its content. I talked a bit about stability earlier and explained the reasonings around needing dynamic reactive support. But secondly, as the load increases at Georgetown, we start to enter an operating condition, or rather an operating risk, where a single contingency or a single loss of an asset has the capability to disconnect up to 60% of the state load at once. And this is as a measure of the total Georgetown load supply plus this additional load. And so part of the project will look to solutions around upgrading Georgetown substation security such to mitigate against that risk, in addition to the dynamic reactive support required, because both of those come from the same trigger. And the baseline condition, as I mentioned, was 300 megawatts as a test case. The actual line in the sand on becoming non-compliant with the 60% threshold is approximately 200 megawatts. So it's not a great deal more load at Georgetown. We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds, 400 to 500 megawatts of load before we start to see issues. We're seeing fairly modest and what we'd consider to be reasonably likely sized loads that have the capability to have to consider augmentations and investments. And given the 2 key dates at the moment, at the commencement of this process, we will advise further on the projected timeline for our RIT as it continues into next year. So I've got at a bit of a pace today. Just wanted to close off my section of this presentation just to mention further information on where you can access the APR from our website directly. It also accompanies supplementary information on substation load profiles, fault level information, network limitations, and our demand forecast data. And as always, your feedback's very welcome. We're interested in discussing opportunities, obviously with interested parties in demand management, and obviously with the active RITs we have going. We very much welcome and encourage feedback from our expressions of interest in those spaces. And we'll provide some advice and feedback as we go through the Waddamana and Georgetown RITs. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Thanks for your attention this afternoon. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Niels. We've got a couple of questions there online, and I'll just read them out to you. We can decide if we're going to cover those now or if we'll defer them to later in the session. So for Marianne, we have a question there around there's some concerns, perhaps misunderstandings in some sectors of the community around a feared negative impact of Basslink on the community's access to well-priced power. Will this be managed by public education? And similarly, current media reporting refers to politics driving nuclear power. Does TasNetworks have a position or is considering this as an alternative? Niels, is that something you'd like to tackle?
To the extent, look, political decisions at a large scale, of course, we can't ignore that there's very active discussions in that space. Our position is at the moment, probably put simply, that we confer and co-plan with AEMO on how they view and what scenarios that they place and weight on energy transition. Something as dramatic as a political decision that will essentially unhinge or very significantly impact the ISP would take the AEMO would treat that very seriously, as we would. Look, definitely from our perspective, I think nuclear would not be a popular or socially responsible option in Tasmania, especially not if it's a very flippant decision or something you just sort of shrugedly resigned to say. It's a discussion that would have to be had with all important members and members of the public and Tasmanians. So I feel it's very important we don't make any hasty judgments on that.
I could add one other piece there in relation to some of the potential political agendas around nuclear. Even with those, there's nothing planned for Tasmania. So yeah, that would be our position.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne. I hope that answers your question, but do come off mute or pop another question in if you need further clarification.
No, thank you. It does answer. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We also have a question from Lee Darcy. Hi, Lee. Thoughts on timing of hydrogen load for Bell Bay? Last week's Bell Bay Major Projects Conference clarified only one potential 300 megawatt load for a methanol project.
Thanks, Lee. Yep. So look, as we go forward, obviously individual load connections, we're still in discussions with proponents. And the RIT that we're putting forward is obviously reflective of the first tranche that we see coming. It's not to say that that's directly attributed to any one customer yet. It's those projects we triggered once those projects are committed and in the public space. But it's still incumbent on us to have to come up with strategies to consider that. So the first window that we're signalling with this RIT is in the 300 megawatt approximate range. Not to say that it directly corresponds with any one customer yet. And the other side, as I'm sure you're aware, we're obviously undertaking or progressing our heads of agreement discussions, which we'll be discussing more with proponents once that's formalised.
Thanks, Niels. Lee, does that cover off for you adequately?
It does, but my question relates more to the graph. It's showing a 300 megawatt load in 2027.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Lee. Look, some of those curves are indicative scenario assumptions. The original RIT, when we did that one, looked at towards the end of 2020, we looked at a generic increase. It wasn't to be attributed with any one customer directly. It's really easy to read specific parts into these. Apologies if that one does line up with what might be a particular load connection at one time. It's more of a broad forecasting envelope.
That's good. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Obviously.
Dane, feel free to go ahead and take yourself off mute if you have a question.
Yeah, sorry, it wouldn't let me use the chat. Just wondering, other than large major industrial load and 300 megawatt loads up at Georgetown, what your view on load growth excluding major industrials was, because the chart that you showed before actually showed a decrease to consumption for 2023.
The decrease to consumption for 23. So, yeah, there are some sensitivities on the AMO load forecast and energy forecast. It's a bit got to be conscious of reductions in energy don't necessarily directly attribute to load demand, depending on whether it's coincident with the peak. Yeah, look, it's a bit of a difficult one to unpack for you, Dane. We can take you through some of the differences in assumptions that we see between forecasting methodology year on year. At the moment, we're aligned to AMO's state level forecast. And so some of the observations we've seen on slight changes in the early years or reductions and increases, we're working through that at the moment. In fact, we're sort of deep in working through the comparison between our previous load forecast and AMO's forecasts. But as you know, it's a very challenging process, given that you've got separate sets of assumptions that underpin those forecasts. Some of the granularity you see year to year is very difficult to ascertain. And even some of the longer term step changes or notches that you see or degradations or moderations are a factor of multiple drivers. So you may see trade-offs between different types of consumption that presents differently.
Can I add something, Liz?
Of course.
Thanks, Dane. I guess more broadly, you know, from a, state perspective, we can see electric vehicles becoming a prominent aspect of load into the future. We also see energy efficiency in lighting and things bringing the load back down. But as Neil sort of alluded to, a lot of these things are, really unknown. So we just have to work on the best forecasts that AMO and ourselves can determine based on the information we have at hand. So hopefully that a little bit of additional info was useful.
Yeah, thanks, Neil and Michael.
Thank you. Any other question for Nils on our 2024 annual planning report? Any of the aspects he's covered off in today's session before we move on to our environmental scan with Jessica Ray? As I said earlier too, if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in session, we're very happy to answer those as well. You're welcome to flick us a message outside of the session and we will get back to you with a suitable response. If we don't have any more questions, I will now hand over to Jessica Ray, who's going to step through an environmental scan, the world in which we find ourselves and some interesting trends specific to Tasmania. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Liz, and great to be joining everyone today. As the head of strategy here at TasNetworks, I have the pleasure of looking after some of the teams like strategy and innovation and advanced analytics who spend a lot of their time looking outward at the environment that we're operating in and trying to understand it and respond to it so that we make sure that we're able to keep that relevance into the future and make sure we're meeting expectations. So that's a little bit of what I wanted to share today. It definitely won't cover everything, but just a little bit of that insight as to what we're looking at. This item is designed to be complementary to what you've heard from Neil about the annual planning report, to look at some of those broader trends that's impacting the sector and how we're addressing those strategically over the long term. So we'll mainly highlight how some of those longer term trends are shaping our thinking and how we respond to those to make sure that we're maintaining safe, reliable and affordable power moving forward. So as we formed up our strategy last year and kept really in mind our purpose of powering a bright future that you can see there, there were 7 key trends occurring in the operating environment that really shaped the way that we need to adapt over the longer term. This isn't absolutely everything that we looked at, but mostly it bunched into these 7 areas. And 3 of those are really typical to the energy sector. And you'll likely have heard of them many times before. So that's decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitalisation, sometimes known as the 3Ds. And these have been driving forces of the Australian energy sector for the last few years and are shaping many of the large-scale commercial investment decisions down through to individual household choices with things like solar and batteries and electric vehicles. And they're really operating in a mutually reinforcing manner across those 3 trends. And Tasmania is seeing that the same as the rest of Australia, really, in that. But we're seeing them take shape in a slightly different way, given a bit of our unique situation and starting point in relation to renewable energy, for example. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. Before delving into those, it is important to note that it isn't just the 3Ds that shape our operating environment, making sure that we have a skilled workforce, that we keep up with regulatory requirements, and Tasmania's demographics are also key and something we've been giving a lot of thought to, but we'll go into a little bit less today. And just to touch on that last element, the socioeconomic element of Tasmania's energy environment is really critical for us to keep in mind and that we are keeping in mind through this transition. Those trends of electric vehicles, solar batteries, and even energy efficient appliances all require customers to be able to purchase them. And that isn't a reality for everyone at this point in time. So whilst costs do continue to reduce for those things, we do need to optimise our response across all customers, not just a segment of them. So we're definitely keeping that much in mind in our customer segmentation last year that you might have seen really highlighted that for us. So if we head on to the next page to explore those 3Ds in a little bit more detail. Taking decarbonisation, for example, will be deeply familiar to many of you, but in Tasmania, unlike the mainland, we don't have that extensive coal or gas to exit the system, but we are part of an interconnected system, and so we're seeing that drive new transmission and large-scale renewable energy connections, many of the elements of which Niels has just taken you through. And then as we look on island, that's really shifting how we have to respond as well, with AEMO forecasting a lot of load growth as businesses in particular electrify and decarbonise from those existing fossil fuel processes. And they're seeing business growth increasing, potentially 50% over the next decade, in that large part due to electrification. In the decentralisation space, we're seeing those consumer patterns shifting as technology and information become more accessible. So where we used to have that really centralised power generation system flowing increasingly downstream through the network towards end consumer, that's increasingly not the case, as would be familiar to many. The first shift that we saw here was those rooftop solar panels, with now around 20% of Tasmanians' households having a solar system installed. And so self-generation and consumption is starting to hit scale, and that's becoming really meaningful on the distribution network, and we'll get into the forecast in a second. But the next set of those emerging elements are already here, between batteries, electric vehicles, controllable appliances, and those are shaping a really different environment and expectation from customers for us to be able to respond and present really different opportunities on the network for us as well. And if we consider some of those AEMO forecasts over the next decade, they're really indicating that drop in Tasmanian residential load as that solar and energy efficiency start to reduce demand in the system. So we're having really different factors play in and out between businesses and residentials, and different factors within that as well. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to foresee and predict how these will play out. If any one of them slows, the impact on the network and the way that energy users consume their energy is really shifting as well. So some of those really large swings are very much dependent on individual customer choices, as well as that broader policy and economic environment that enables them, such as building standards, technology costs, and cost of living. So all of those items that are shifting how we're looking into that future. And finally, sometimes underlooked in the componentry of it, but it's what allows us to take what could be risks or suboptimal use of the network and make it more optimal, which is that digitalization. So we see that those connected devices, whether they're batteries, solar, or otherwise, we can take them as individual assets where they might not act in the best interest of the overall system or for the individual, and start to use those in a bit more of a coordinated manner. So with Tasmania at over 80% of the way through its smart meter rollout, that ability to use digital and data to optimize operations, particularly through in the distribution network that hasn't been able to be done before down to the household level, is really starting to become accessible. And so on the next page, if we dive into some of those customer-led sub-trends a little bit further, we see some of the shifts that could eventuate and the scale of them. It's important to note that none of these figures are guaranteed and really just a forecast of trajectory based on policy settings and industry trends. So they should more be taken as a kind of scale and illustrative view than any particular numbers to be wedded to. But you can see at the top there that electrification presents a really significant load, primarily driven by businesses switching their processes to electricity over other energy sources over the coming decades, and making sure that that can be met through the electricity system is a really key part of what we need to be prepared for as the network moving forward, and an element that we're giving a lot of thought to support that ongoing economic growth for Tasmania. Beneath that, you can see electric vehicles are a really growing proportion that could keep going in a rapid growth phase or begin to slow after early adoption. But if it does continue in that rapid growth phase, we are looking at a really significant set of essentially mobile electricity demand that will be really important to plan for and make sure that we can to manage that transition without significant costs to customers or consumers through that as well. And whilst rooftop solar has already had a really significant growth around Australia, in Tasmania, it is forecast to more than double again, which would take us to a level that's a bit more akin to New South Wales today in terms of level of penetration of households with solar on their roofs. And the impact of this might be mitigated by batteries, but those also still remain relatively expensive to deploy. So there's a lot of different individual trends playing out in different ways at different times, and with a lot of uncertainty occurring as well. So those are all kind of elements that we're starting to grapple with. As we head on to the next page, this just gives us a bit of a sense of solar in particular over those last 10 years, because we saw on the prior page a lot of really rapid growth, a lot of doubling of numbers, really significant amounts. But that has already occurred in solar, for example. So we've already had that tripling of installed capacity over the last 10 years. So to see it increase again over the next 10 is not necessarily unrealistic. And looking more broadly outside of Tasmania, it's an interesting one that within Australia as a whole, yes, we lag. Australia as an average is about 35% of households with solar on their roofs, if you look at the Clean Energy Council stats about it. And we're at about 20%, but globally, Australia still leads, and Tasmania at 20% still is very, very leading in that. So really at that edge of trying to work out what that means for networks and make sure that it is smooth a transition as possible. If you look at California, for example, one of the more progressive and scaled areas, it's at 10% or less still. So a lot of areas around the world looking to Australia and identifying what we are doing to manage this within the transition as well. On the next page, we just have a bit of a sense of there's lots of different factors moving in different directions, as we touched on, and I think Niels did as well. And across those various factors, each of them will impact the network differently. But broadly, we're seeing a much more peaky load as we follow those forecasts into the future. So reduced demand in the middle of the day as solar hits to a peak in the morning and evening. And sometimes it can be both morning and evening or one or the other, depending on the kind of composition of the customers within that area as more electrical appliances, for example, are used. And we're likely to see this play out really differently across the network. So each of those trends play out differently. If we have a really business heavy area, we might see really high demand growth due to electrification with that 50% of business growth, versus if it's a really residential area, actually seeing that decline as there's a lot more energy efficiency and solar coming through. So we're likely to see this play out across the depths of the distribution network in really different ways based on those demographics in the local area. And so that could lead to really different results at different levels of the network. So managing the network across all of those is key, and that's where that digitalization and visibility of the network is a really important element for us strategically moving forward, to get that visibility so that we can see at as granular level as possible and as is appropriate how that's occurring, and we can meet customer expectations in connecting as well. On the next page, this just gives a bit of a sense as to strategically what we're looking at in that forecast. So we've got that forecast shift in what our customers will need from their electricity supply. And so we've been working out as a network how we need to set ourselves up over the longer term to make sure we're able to respond to that. And this is just a part of that, not the full picture at this point in time. But at the heart of that response is a network with greater visibility, monitoring, and ability to interface to those distributed and customer assets. If we don't know where they are and how they're operating, then there might be unintended impact to the network, but getting that visibility and coordination will allow a much more smooth transition across the network and for customers as well, to make sure that that safe, reliable and affordable power stays a key tenet of what we're delivering and providing to everyone. So it'll be impossible to forecast exactly what's going to be installed where, but using that increased digital and data insights available to us, we'll be able to work with customers to optimally manage that transition. And over the right-hand side of this page, it's just a few examples about the types of things that could mean. So whether it's managing the peak load and network configuration to avoid transformers getting overloaded, or to prevent augmenting the transformer in the network for a peak that is just a couple of hours in one day, in 1 year, for example. So getting those insights into our way of operating, which is already deep in there with the annual planning report, but with that complexity that will be emerging through the distribution network, a really key part of what we're looking to do over the long term. Other areas such as making sure that we're considering how batteries might be able to absorb that solar power and ease peak loads, and how we're looking at solar across the network to maximize that benefit and that generation without facing constraints or managing those constraints where they do occur. So a lot of different factors that we're looking to bring together over the coming years, but we've got 10 years or so according to those forecasts to get to that scale that we were presenting there, but it's definitely coming to Tasmania, and you only need to look at other states around Australia to see some of those effects that they're already facing into at this point in time. So it's very much part of our strategy and something that we're looking at. So that was just a few of the insights of the broader operating environment that are starting to influence what you can see there in the annual planning report, for example, and how that's playing out, with a bit of a focus on the distribution network. And happy to take any questions if anyone had any.
Any curly questions for Jess around our operating environment, which continues to evolve in exciting ways? I think you've been too thorough, Jess. There's no questions. Okay, well, just reiterating, if you do think of something afterwards, we'd be happy to answer that